All right. So I imagine most of you are familiar with the Creed of Nicaea. You've perhaps in its form or in its longer form amended at Constantinople in 381. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Chalcedonian or Chalcedonian, depends on if you pronounce the CH as a hard K sound or just a CH sound. But the conference held in Chalcedon in the year 451. Now, at this particular event in 451, Leo I was Pope. And so those of you that are going to be followers of church history are going to be aware there's kind of a line you can draw here between Athanasius at Nicaea through Leo, in a sense, in 451. And if you are ever in a patristics class, you'll certainly read Leo's tome on the incarnation of the Word if you haven't already. So in 451, this council gets together because it's having to deal with a problem, a crisis that had arisen as a result of Nicaea. And that was this: if we talk about Jesus as two natures, duo phusesin in Greek, two natures, two phuses, two beings. If we talk about Jesus as having two natures, and you have to do that because Jesus is both divine and Jesus is human. And the way the early church framed all these early Christological questions with such vigor as though this Platonism was going to work, at any rate, at Chalcedon, here's what you're going to get. When you talk about Jesus in two natures, there are four things you cannot do. Now, this is important. Chalcedon doesn't tell us how we can discourse on the human or divine natures of Jesus. It simply sets up four limitations, four boundaries or barriers, or as it were, four fences or walls in which we're free to walk around and talk Christology all we want, as long as we don't cross one of these boundaries. And here's the four boundaries from Chalcedon when discussing the two natures of Christ. You can't confuse them, mix them, mingle them. You can't change them to fit so that they fit each other. You can't divide them. They're indivisible. Indivise in Latin and adiareptos in Greek. They're indivisible. They belong together. And the last one is a synonym of that. They are inseparable. So you can't confuse them or mix them, the two natures. You can't change either one of them to fit the other. You can't divide them, and you can't separate them. They belong together. Now, remembering what I told you last week, that the Trinity, the doctrine of the Trinity at Nicaea, really functions as a hermeneutic. And this is really important because one of the things that we're going to see today that we've seen last week that I've mentioned many times before is this. When you come to this business of doing theological discourse, and you start with the word God, and the next word is human, the first thing you have to do is have definitions to those terms. You have to know what a God is. You have to know what a human is before you can talk about the God-human relationship. This is where this entire tradition is going to run to ground so quick and go to seed so fast in the first 600 years of the early church, with all of the Christological controversies and all of the heresies. They started with a priori definitions of what constitutes a God and what constitutes the human being. Those definitions, in both cases, in my opinion, are not only outdated, but they're actually wrong. And so Christian theology, for a good part of its history, has been trying to put together a God, a priori defined and humans a priori defined together, and we can't do it. And we've spent 2,000 years trying to do it because we're trying to do it within a way of thinking, a worldview that is incapable of allowing revelation in, primarily because it's dualistic. Now, when it comes to Chalcedon and its relation to Nicaea, if Nicaea is to be understood as a hermeneutic, that is, when I go into a mass on a Sunday morning, at some point in that mass, in a proper liturgical tradition, now Roman Catholic or Lutheran or even some Reformed traditions, Episcopalian, Anglican, the more liturgical churches, I'm going to recite this: I believe in God the Father, the Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, who was conceived by the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, was suffered under Pontius Pilate, crucified, died, and was buried. And I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Holy Catholic Church. And on, I'm going to recite that. What I'm reciting is my hermeneutic. That is, I'm allowing the doctrine of the Trinity, that is the revelation of the Father in the Son by the Spirit, to redefine what a God is, even what the category of a God is. This is very, very important. If we come to this term God with anything other than God revealed, the Father revealed in the Son by the Spirit, if we come with anything else, we're going to automatically create an idol. The doctrine of the Trinity is the absolute anti-idolatrous hermeneutic. It doesn't allow us to create an idol. It asserts that the one we see in the Son is the Father. And yes, it does this in the language of Platonic metaphysics. Yes, it does it in the language of being and nature and person. It's doing its best with this language system to talk about identity and character. And this is the shift we are going to make today and next week. What I'm going to suggest to you is this: the Nicene Creed, as a statement of faith, I'll use the word faith instead of trust, as a statement of faith, is okay. And that's all I'm going to say about it. It's okay. I think it has its issues. I think that we have a right to ask questions about that creed. This is an Anabaptist position. Of course, if you're Catholic or Anglican or otherwise, there's that creed's an ecumenical creed. You don't question it, end of story. But at any rate, for me, I think we can question the creed as a statement of faith, but we cannot question what's happening within that creed. And what's happening within that creed is that there is a logic that is being worked out. So one can say that when one looks at Jesus, one sees the Father. That's the part that the creed is trying to work out. Now, the creed never works out the other half. What the Son hears, he obeys. The creed never talks about that more positive direction, only the Godward human direction. So we can ask questions about the creed and we can flesh it out. But the point is here, the doctrine of the Trinity is a hermeneutic. And this, I suggested to you, is why Karl Barth begins his Church Dogmatics in volume 1, which is the Prolegomenon. First talking about theology as a science, and then he sits and he starts gutting out the doctrine of the Trinity and the relationship of the two natures. Okay? Now, there's an important essay I've mentioned to you before by Tom Torrance that's had an influence on this whole business that I think through when I think through the creeds and Athanasius, and that's this. It's in his book, Transformation and Convergence in the Frame of Knowledge. The essay is titled Newton, Einstein, and Scientific Theology. What Torrance argues is that the same principles that Einstein applied to physics were identical to those Athanasius deployed in regard to theology. And it's really very simple. In physics, since Einstein, we know that reality can be measured, and I use reality lowercase r. We know that things, reality, can be measured both as particles and as waves. That is, we can know where a thing is, but not where it's going. Or we can know where a thing is going, but never where it is. And these are the two main components, particle theory and wave theory, that together combined allow us to think in terms of relativity in physics. You do not measure particles with wave theory. And you don't go at looking at matter. You don't go looking at waves with particle theory. You don't go looking at particles with wave theory. You have to use the proper theory that allows you to interrogate the information that's being given to you by the subject under review. That is the Athanasian theory of revelation in a nutshell. God redefines God's self. God gives us the information and methods as a means by which or how God is to be known. Okay? In the same way, when we apply our resources to this business of knowing God, we can't go deploying the wrong methodologies in the wrong spheres. Because if we do, it's going to be like trying to describe particles with wave theory or waves with particle theory. It won't work. So when it comes to this business of descriptive or this business of framing a proper Christology, framing a view of God in the light of the doctrine of the Trinity, we have to work with the information we are given, which completely subverts anything else. Now, I've argued before, I'll argue again. This is the last chapter of my PhD dissertation. It's at the center of the book, Knowing God. That's the chapter on the crucifixion, where I argue, I make a case that all Christian theology begins with the cross, where God concepts go to die. There's no God concept out there that can survive the crucifixion of Jesus. They simply die. And furthermore, I've said, we have to take our definition of who we are as humans in relation to God from the cross, that we are primarily persecutorial, vampiric, and generally nasty and brute as a species. For all of the good we think we do, and for all of the good that we actually do and we think we are and that we may well be, the fact is, when push comes to shove, as Paul will say, all are sinners. That's what the cross reveals. So when we begin with the cross as this epistemological starting point, we ask, where was the Father in the cross? This is what Paul did. I'm preparing this PowerPoint presentation, folks, on Paul's shift from the Thessalonian letters to the later letters. But all Paul did was rethink the Father's relationship to the cross. That's all Paul did. And in the light of that, eschatology, the resurrection, everything else was rethunk as well. But for Paul, when you look at Calvary, what do you see? Do you see a God? No, you do not. You see a criminal being persecuted. What else do you see? Well, if you have eyes to see, you see basically someone that's been falsely accused, someone's been tried and convicted, and someone's been executed falsely and innocently. That's what you see. You know, if you're willing to see further, you're willing to see that this figure who undergoes this process has made certain claims to a relationship with this one everybody else calls God, but that he simply names as Papa, Abba. And that's what Paul was able to see, and the breakthrough that was able to occur to him, that God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself. There was nothing else happening that day. That's the only thing that was happening. That's what the Father was doing. That's where the Father was. That's not like the gods. The gods are not like this. The death of Jesus reconfigures entirely the category of God. That's why the category of God dies at the cross. So much so that if I'm asked today, do I believe in a God, or do I believe that God exists? I have to basically say, I don't know and I don't care, because I don't care about gods in general or a God. What I do care about is that the one who makes all things is revealed God's self to be a loving, nurturing, caring, redeeming, liberating, inspirational, effective presence and redeemer. And that's what I have to work with. So what is Chalcedon doing by saying we can't mix together the natures of Jesus? We can't change them, divide them, or separate them. What it's doing is it's holding together theological discourse and anthropological discourse. It's saying you cannot talk theology without talking about anthropology. Theology is not anthropology. They're different. Can't mix them together to create some new thing. But you can't separate them, so you can just talk theology without anthropology. And you can't change them to make them fit. That's all that Chalcedon is saying. Now, when this is done within the language of Platonism, okay, nature, substance, being, person, will, mind, that Platonic universe, yes, it gets convoluted and absolutely ugly. And it's just almost impossible to try and create a Jesus that is anything like a Jesus should be, because the categories are bursting at the seams. The problem was, or is, that those that came to the question of Christology, beginning with Justin Martyr and his adoption of the Logos theory, all of these worked on the assumption that when the New Testament writers used the word theos, God, they meant the same thing as everyone else in the ancient world. And if there's anything that the New Testament is, one can certainly say with certainty that it does, is it demolishes all constructs of what a God is or how a God should be. So if Nicaea is our Trinitarian hermeneutic, and we allow it to redefine what divinity is for us, divinity is not powerful, divinity is weak. Divinity is not two-faced, divinity is only loving. Divinity is not one, like a monad. Divinity is relational. Divinity is not a thing. There's character, descriptive character that one can make about divinity. We have spent now 1700 years learning how to allow this business of the Trinity to help us redefine God. I think that the Enlightenment is a direct result of Nicaea, because the Enlightenment, that the approach of the Enlightenment is to allow that which is empirically studied to speak for itself, to come as a clean slate. Well, we know that a lot of these Enlightenment presuppositions are false, but the point is, when you say, when it comes to religion, we have to let God be God. We have to let God give us the categories by which God is to be known and understood and followed. And we have to be willing to let all other categories about what a God is like be erased from our heads. We've spent 1,700 years doing that, but we've only spent the last 100 years actually starting to redefine anthropology. What does it mean to be human? So when you go back to these early Christological debates, they're saying, how is Jesus like us? What does it mean to be human? And the first thing they do is this Aristotelian move. We humans can be distinguished from the animal species by virtue of our reason. And so what makes us human is our reason, our ability to rationalize, our capacity to think. And that's where Gnosticism enters. That's where Apollinarianism enters, that Jesus had the divine mind. The rest of him was human, but he had the divine mind. He's mixing the natures there. All of this arises from the inability of this Platonic metaphysics to hold the revelation, the character of this new God. So, in a nutshell, we have a two-sided problem in modern Christian theology, which Chalcedon will challenge. One is not recognizing that Nicaea is a hermeneutic, not a set of propositions to be acknowledged. Second, there is a lack of recognition of the cross as the place where we begin our Trinitarian hermeneutic. We don't begin our Trinitarian hermeneutic in the abstract by talking about a God concept and then breaking it down into nature and persons and being. That has come to a dead end. We start by asking where the Father was at the cross and where the Spirit is at the cross, because you'll remember, for the Johannine author, Pentecost doesn't occur 40 days after the death of Jesus. Pentecost occurs, second of all, in an upper room in John 20. But before that, in John 19, when Jesus pneumas his last, he expires, he's giving the Spirit from the cross. There's your doctrine of the Trinity. And the two writers that are thinking this through are Paul and the writer of the Johannine community. They're starting to put this together as the pattern of revelation. So here's what I want to suggest to you. When it comes to these ancient creeds and councils that are important in terms of theological discourse, that is, if we are going to make a claim that we can do Christian theology within the sphere of the church as it's been historically understood for 2,000 years, we're going to make that claim that that's the kind of theology we're doing. We have to be able to recognize what it is that's going on with these ecumenical councils, in particular Nicaea and Chalcedon. But we don't have to enter into their arguments with their worldview. We are now able, after the demise of philosophy in the 20th century under Jacques Derrida and deconstruction, we are now able to enter into this new discourse where we are saying the same thing, but instead of using the language of nature, we are using the language of character. And instead of using the language of metaphysics, we're using the language of story and drama. That is, we are fundamentally recognizing that the proper way to do theological discourse is to do it as story, as a narrative. Now, we've always known this anthropologically, because whenever someone says, tell me about your walk with Christ, well, we've got a whole story we can tell them. It's a narrative. Jesus did this for me and this for me and that for me. That's a narrative. What we have yet to learn to do is to create our doctrine as story. That is, to use the language of Urs von Balthasar to create a theodrama, the God drama. This is where the work of Raymond Schwager becomes so important to me and to any mimetic theorist, because it's Schwager who was able to take this category of von Balthasar's of the theodrama and show definitively that in fact what's going on is both a redefinition of the character of God and a redefinition of the human. That's his Jesus and the Drama of Salvation book. It's absolutely amazing what's happening at the cross if you let it work you. It's the whole point of meditation on the crucifixion narrative is precisely because it destroys all false pretenses one has about what a God is, but it also destroys all false pretenses about who the self is. Okay. So here's how I want to suggest to you that we approach this business of Chalcedon. There's the divinity of Jesus, there's the humanity of Jesus. They're not to be confused, separated, divided, mixed up, or anything else. They each have their place in the discourse. When you go to the fourfold Christological paradigm that I developed, you have the Jesus of experience, the risen Christ, that the one that we experience together in the assembly when we sing and give thanks and pray and break bread. The experience of the Christus Praesens, the present Christ, the Lord of the universe. We have also the Jesus of the tradition that we're talking about now. And that tradition, as we'll note in a moment, has tended to magnify the divinity of Jesus far beyond his humanity. Then we have the textual Jesus, the Jesus as he's perceived of by the various New Testament writers and the traditions underlying them. And then we have the historical Jesus, in air quotes, the Jesus created by scholars. My suggestion to you is this: it is not our place to take the tools by which we engage the textual Jesus and the historical Jesus and try to measure the Jesus of the tradition or the Jesus of the church's experience. Nor can we take the measuring tools of the church's experience and this philosophical orientation, its involvement in Platonism, to talk about the divinity of Jesus and apply it to the textual Jesus, or God forbid, the historical Jesus. They are two different ways of talking about the same thing. Jesus the particle, Jesus the wave. Jesus is human, Jesus is divine. Neither one, in and of itself, says anything. But when brought together, now we have field theory. In the same way, when we are going to discourse about Jesus, we can't mix these spheres up. Here's the problem with modern liberalism, folks. Think about this for just a moment. The modern liberal has tossed out entirely the Jesus of the tradition. There's a whole swath of liberalism in America that denies fundamentally the resurrection from the dead, Jesus' resurrection from the dead. That's where they start. And then any logos theory or any virgin birth, anything that's going to, buttress an argument for his divinity, that gets stripped away. Jesus becomes a man, a good man, sometimes even a prophet, sometimes even a visionary who saw God that in a very unique way. But in liberalism, Jesus is not the Son of the Father. Nor in liberalism can you say God has definitively revealed God's self in Jesus. Because in liberalism, you have to leave room for God to reveal God's self in Mohammed and Moses and Buddha and Jim Jones and Donald Trump and everybody else. You have to leave room. That's the problem. So we're at this place where we have to make sure that we don't end up doing what the liberals do, and that's throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but neither can we do what the evangelicals and the conservatives and the fundamentalists do, which is to mix them Okay, your modern evangelicals are Monophysite. They've mixed the two natures. Most often they're Apollinarian. They actually believe Jesus was human, except there was some part of him that was still divine, that wasn't affected by sin. Okay, he wasn't really human, and that makes him a third thing, neither God nor human, but some kind of third thing. And this has always been the burden, going all the way back to the Arian controversy that led up to Nicaea and following. The big question is it the divinity of Jesus that saves us, or is it the humanity of Jesus that saves us? That's the big debate, back and forth and back and forth. And I think Chalcedon is correct. It's not an either or. It's the Son in relation to the Father, doing what he hears the Father say, are doing what he sees the Father doing, and saying what he hears the Father say. It's this category of imitation that now becomes key to changing the discourse. I want to tell you, I'm going to say straight up front, mimetic theory at this point offers the best way in to reconceiving Nicaea and Chalcedon, because it gives us the ability to talk about mimesis and desire, and it allows us to see the importance of this, both anthropologically as well as theologically. Here is the reality. If you got notes, God, the term God, divinity, and myth all belong together. We develop gods, we mythologize these gods. So the category of divinity or transcendence that is birthed out of the scapegoat mechanism, out of blood, out of death, and we create religion, we create gods from this, we create divinities that are Janus-faced. The categories God, divinity, and myth belong together. The categories Jesus, divinity, and gospel belong together. Jesus is the redefinition of the category of God, in as much as gospel's the redefinition or the deconstruction or the revelation of what a myth is. They both talk about divinity. God, divinity, myth. Jesus, divinity, gospel. But divinity is completely reconfigured, and one only has to turn to a text like the great hymn in Philippians chapter 2, who, being in the form of God, and morphe theou, did not consider equality with God to consist in the act of grasping divinity, but instead let it go, emptied himself, took the form of a servant. That's a total rethink of the category of what divinity is. The gods simply aren't servants. It's a total rethink. The problem with our liberal friends is they're correct to note that God and myth go together. They just never allow Jesus to redefine or reconfigure myth in terms of gospel. So we have a need for a new anthropology, which I want to suggest is going to be a mimetic anthropology. And the reason it's a mimetic anthropology is because I think of all the anthropological frames of reference out there, only the mimetic anthropology can do two things. One, it can actually be found within the larger development of the biblical or canonical tradition. And if you include the other literature that goes with the development of the biblical and canonical tradition of the Apocrypha, the Pseudepigrapha, the Mishnah, and so on, the Talmud, Judaisms, and then Christianity's early Christian Apocrypha, the Fathers, and all of that, all the commentary, you can see an absolutely rich it's a gold mine for being able to resource this kind of thinking, because it's out there, it's everywhere. Okay, remember the marks of violence Girard talks about, all of these things. It's there. It's there. You don't have to look hard. If you were panning for gold, you'd be rich, and no matter what document in what era you were panning in. Mimetic anthropology allows us to talk about the process of imitation, that is, how the Son becomes the revealer of the Father, that is, through the process of copying the Father, becoming an exact replica. We think of the language of Hebrews 1:1-3 here, or even that of the fourth gospel, where Jesus says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. The disciples didn't understand Jesus was redefining the category of God. They didn't get that. That's what they didn't get. That's why they kept asking this. They thought that Jesus God was the one he called Father. They wanted to see that God. They wanted that God to come down and say, hey, this kid's right. I'm really here and you've really got it. And it's all good. So this now raises the final question. If we're going to use a mimetic theoretical framework for an anthropology, and we have to use something, and for my money, Platonism no longer works. The discipline known as psychotherapy no longer works. Current disciplines and ways of speaking anthropologically, like critical race theory, don't work. None of these theories has been able to take into account the actual data of mimesis, data relating to the hardwiring of our brains and mirror neural systems, data relating to conflict and escalation of conflict, communities scapegoating other human beings, beginning from ancient ritual through modern cannibalism to countries sending their youth off to war. All of these forms and mechanisms can be seen together as a large thing within the mimetic anthropology, and these other disciplines can't take all of this into consideration, which is what makes the mimetic theory really a form of realism, as Bob Hamilton Kelly used to call it, mimetic realism. So mimetic theory is able to take into account the biblical frame, but it's also able to take into account all of these other frames as well, whether they're literary, archaeological, psychological, etc. So the question that we need to ask, then, this being the case, if we are interdividual, as we know this in mimetic theory, there's no such thing as an individual. We are interdividual. We are our relationships. If we are our relationships, Jesus is his relationships. There's no such thing as Jesus by himself. There's the Father-Son relationship. There is the Son-Spirit relationship. There's the Jesus-Church relationship. There's the mentor-student relationship and discipleship by the Spirit. Jesus is his relationships, and so are we. This is exactly why we have to shift away from metaphysics and propositional thinking about Jesus as the Son of the Father and the true human. They are not distinct things. They are two ways of talking about the same reality, but they are simply discourses, not things in themselves. So we can hold on to these creeds, but we can hold on to them lightly. We can hold on to the lessons learned from these creeds and these councils, I think, with an awful lot of respect for, the fathers went through an awful lot having to think through this stuff with the limited tools they had available to them. But at the beginning of the 21st century, if there's going to be any hope at all for being able to talk about Jesus as the divine Son of the Father sent into the world, and to be able to talk about Jesus as the true human who learns through suffering, then we're going to have to recognize they are both the same discourse in different words.